Hello, my name is Jacob Galantska, and today I'm going to be discussing The Mystery of Capital by Hernando De Soto. So the question that this book will look to answer is why capitalism triumphs in the West and fails everywhere else. So the book will be comparing the developed West versus developing and former communist nations. Now it should be noted that this book was published in the year 2000, so some of the countries have certainly come a long way since then. So the Western perspective on why they believe capitalism fails elsewhere is that the people are simply lazy or not intelligent or perhaps missed the Protestant Revolution. Now, these are pretty weak arguments considering the diverse groupings of successful and not so successful nations. So if culture alone can't describe the failure of capitalism, then why? Why are smart, entrepreneurial, tech-savvy people in developing nations failing to implement capitalism? Well, De Soto discusses 5 topics which will help explain this phenomena, all of which will be covered in this presentation. The mystery of missing information is the first topic of the book. So something important to note about the developing and formerly communist nations which are discussed in the book is that 80% of the population of these nations lack legally enforceable transactions on property rights. Now this is partially due to the fact that the nations don't adequately define private possession and the rights associated with them. So this makes it really hard to identify who owns what in terms of assets. A major obstacle that a majority of the people in developing nations face when trying to obtain legal property is just the daunting legal process that goes along with it. I mean, these are simple processes in advanced countries, but they're just so needlessly difficult elsewhere. I mean, one example is obtaining legal authorization to build a house in Peru can take 6 years and 11 months. And this chart shows the procedures to formalize a legally obtained home in Peru, and just the first stage out of 5 can take 207 steps. Because these processes are so daunting, operating outside the law becomes a very attractive option. And this creates the extra legal sector. And while it may be a minority in the West, think the black market, it's actually the norm in developing nations. People in this sector don't technically possess legal ownership of anything that they have. And to just kind of put into perspective the significance of this, the total value of the real estate held but not legally owned by the poor of third world and former communist nations is $9.3 trillion, about twice as much as the total circulating US money supply. So the next chapter of the book is The Mystery of Capital. So a concept discussed in this chapter is Braudels bell jar, and this kind of refers to capitalism as sort of an exclusive club, and that only the 20% that actually have access to property rights really get to enjoy the benefits of capitalism, while the other 80% sit outside of this figurative bell jar and kind of have to operate outside of the system. And the issue is that these people cannot draw economic life from their assets. For example, they don't have the legal title to their home, so they can't use their home to sort of leverage out and get a loan and use that to finance their enterprises. And the issue here is that assets need to be viewed conceptually, not just what they are in their natural state, but their potential and what they can be used for. So the third chapter, The Mystery of Political Awareness, refers to just the blindness of these governments to realize the extralegal sector is operating. And it's not to say that they don't know that it exists, but they don't quite respect the magnitude of just how much of it takes place in their country. And simultaneously, they need to realize that people aren't the problem. These people operating in the extralegal industries are productive people, and in many cases, the extra-legal industries outperform their legal counterparts. It's the laws that are the issue, and if these countries could just adjust their laws so that they aren't pushing people away from operating legally, they would really be able to harness the sort of revolutions that they would be going through at the time. The fourth chapter is titled Missing Lessons of U.S. History, and I found this to be a great chapter because we get to look at a country that is now very successful at implementing capitalism, and we get to see how they dealt with some of the same issues that these third world and former communist nations are facing today. And eventually they were able to gradually overcome this problem, but let's see how they did it. So looking at the settlement of early North America, squatting was a very common practice. And this was just settling on property that you didn't have a legal title to. And squatters were viewed as trespassers by the politicians because they didn't actually own any of the land that they were settling on. They just kind of took over it because they didn't want to have to deal with the formal process, which at the time was very burdensome. And the squatters actually invented sort of their own species of extra legal property titles, which were called tomahawk rights and eventually cabin rights and corn rights. So basically what they would do, and it was pretty simplistic, they would either maybe cut little scrapings into trees to kind of mark what land was theirs, or they would find land and just build a cabin on it or grow corn on it, and kind of people would just mutually agree that if you did that, then that land was yours. And the government didn't react well to this. Initially, they tried to punish the squatters by making them move off the land or pay for their lands. And the squatters didn't take too kindly to this and refused. And sheriffs were told at this point to initiate the ejection procedure. And this created a huge conflict, one that the book refers to as something like open warfare. So the political views of the squatters would kind of shift back and forth over the years. And at a certain point, they actually realized that there was a benefit of the squatters and they weren't necessarily a hindrance of the country. And at this point, they gave them preemption rights, which was basically they would allow a squatter to buy land from a landowner if they had settled on their land and actually made improvements to it, which was a big step for them, and kind of that was the marking point of realizing that squatters weren't necessarily a hindrance on the country. And eventually the Northwest Ordinance would be released, which would basically be the government selling off their lands. But they sold it off at prices that were just far too high for the settlers, and they would rather just deal with the uncertainties of unlawfully settling on land than have to pay that amount because they really couldn't afford it. And once this started happening, the government kind of maintained a stance that they weren't necessarily in favor of the squatters, but slowly but surely their opinions would sort of shift back towards respecting the squatters, and eventually they would just kind of come down to their level and kind of integrate their little social norms and laws into the actual law, and that's how they came to integrate the extra legal population. So chapter 5 is the mystery of legal failure. So as seen on the slide here, nearly every developing and former communist nation has a formal property system. That isn't the issue. The issue is that the systems that they have are flawed, leaving most of their population unable to gain access to it. So the issue is actually the bell jar that was mentioned earlier. And a common misconception that the governments have is that people are operating in the extra legal sector just to avoid taxes, but they don't even consider the fact that these people probably incur more costs by trying to avoid the authorities, and that these costs end up being probably far worse than taxes. So lifting the bell jar comes with its challenges. Many of them are legal challenges. So the legal structure that a country wants to build has to build off the extra legal social contracts that have already been developed. And ignoring them just simply is not an option, because what will happen if they ignore these extra legal social contracts is that the people will continue operating outside the law as they are. And I know a common thought is that, well, these are the laws, these people cannot just keep breaking it. But as mentioned on the slide, when obedience breaks down on a large enough scale, there's no authority that is strong enough to please everyone. So they're going to have to compromise. And the best way for them to do this is to examine the people's law and find out what exactly the people are doing, and sort of create a bridge that the people will be willingly walk across to this sort of new structure. Lifting the bell jar also comes with its political challenges, And most of these challenges come from the fact that the elites of the country, those that are within the bell jar, will resist change because they feel like they have more to lose. And the book gives a great example of an eagle's nest analogy. And it mentions that it's not just as simple as running a bulldozer through garbage, and it's more like rearranging the twigs of a massive eagle's nest, but without disturbing the eagle inside. And that's kind of what they'll have to do, is find a way that they can kind of help these poor people find their way within the system without sort of irritating the elites of the country who are kind of happy where they stand. And powerful reform is difficult to enact, admittedly, and they're not going to be able to do it at a low level. They're going to need the leaders of the country to try and get everybody on board with sort of integrating everyone into one structured legal property system. So to conclude this presentation, I'd like to kind of just mention a few takeaways. Formal property must be universally accessible, because if it's not, the poor of a country will sort of see capitalism just as an exclusive club that they'll never really get into. And well-crafted property representation is crucial for helping us realize the potential of our assets and what exactly it is that we can do with them. And finally, the poor are not the problem. These are productive people. These are people with entrepreneurial spirit who are producing quite well outside of the system, and they are the solution to the problem. Once we can integrate them within the legal system, we will have prosperity and a well-integrated capitalist system. So that will conclude my presentation today on the ideas that were brought to life in The Mystery of Capital by Hernando De Soto. It was a great book, and I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.